Alright, so this is going to be our third of our bracelets in this set, and this one actually has got a bit of a Nordic inspiration for me, and I'll show you what I mean. That this is the sample that I've made, and as you can tell, the spacing between the knots and how it's exposing the braided cord underneath just gives that sort of Nordic feel, kind of medieval Renaissance sort of thing going on with it. So let's get on with it. So what we're using here, these are 3 strands of the 2mm cotton cord, and I'm using it right now undyed. I would recommend for this piece to either dye your cord lovely brown or even like a hunter green. I think it would look pretty with that. The reason I'm doing it without having the cord dyed is so you could see what I'm doing a little bit better. I've noticed that when I use too dark of a cord, it doesn't read well for the video, so that's why I'm doing it without the cord dyed. So what I want to do is I want to start by braiding my cord. So I'm going to tie an overhand knot at one end. And what I'm going to want to do is this end that I'm starting at is actually, I want to arrange the cords so this is actually how it's going to look for when the bracelet is finished, so I don't have to do anything else with this end of the bracelet later on. So I'm going ahead and tightening things up. I've got about an inch, roughly an inch of cord sticking out the end with the little knots on it, and I'm happy with that. So I'm just going to pin this to the board, and I'm going to braid it. Alright, so I've got it braided all the way to the end. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do a loose overhand knot just to keep it from unbraiding and causing me an issue later on. Alright, I don't want to make this super tight because I'm going to have to be able to slip my Turk's head knot over the end later on when it's time to add the Turk's head knot to it, so I need to make sure that I'm going to be able to get that on here. Alright, so what we want to do is we're going to start with our cord that we're doing our square knots with, and we need to find its center, so we're going to match up the two cut ends and just trace it back, and that's our center, this loop right here. So what I want to do is I want to measure 4 inches in from the end of the braid. We're not doing a lot of square knots and beading on this. I'm wanting to make sure that the majority of what we see, well, what you see when you're wearing this bracelet, let me actually do an example. So if you're wearing the bracelet, you've got majority of this is going to be on the underside of your wrist, and that's where things will be crossing over. You'll have your Turk's head knot there holding it together, and you want to see the majority of what's going on up here. So actually 4 inches in is a bit far. Let's start at 3 inches in. So roughly 3 inches in from there is a good spot to start our square knots. So we're going to attach this cord to our braid, with just a bit of a tie like that. And now we're going to start doing our square knots. So what we're going to do is we're going to do 3 square knots, and then we're going to add beads, and 3 square knots and add beads. But when we do our square knots, we're not going to be doing them super tight, because what we want is that rustic look to things, to where we're actually being able to see our braided cord underneath our knots. And you'll see what I mean here in a minute. Okay, so there's our first square knot, and we're not pulling it super tight because I want that gap there between the cords. So you're seeing there's the bump for our first square knot. And now when we do the second square knot, we're going to get the same effect. And what it's going to be doing is it's going to give us this zigzag effect here, because we're allowing these gaps to remain. And that's what using this heavier cord underneath the wax linen, that's what it'll do for us. It'll create this zigzag effect, which basically looks like stitching, and over the top of the braid, it just works. I like the way that it's giving that rustic sort of feel to it, and it definitely would work if, like, you're going to the Highland Games. This would be a good bracelet to wear for that, or even going to the Renaissance Fair. So again, it's creating that openness and that zigzag effect. So after 3 square knots, then we're just going to simply add a bead on either side. And these 6mm beads, they've got a really generous size hole in them. When you can find the hole in them, there it is. And that this wax linen cord goes through that hole fairly easily. You just have to make sure you've smoothed out the cut end of your wax linen to where it's a bit more on the pointy side to actually go into the hole a bit easier. And in terms of which colors to select of the beads, I just randomly grab one. I don't purposely try to select a specific color. I like these agates because they're all varied in colors, and that's how they come when you buy them on the strand, that it's mixed colors, usually within the same palette. And then your next square knot after you add on beads, you're just going to adjust it until your beads are resting the way you want them. And again, 3 square knots, and then add on your next set of beads. And for this, it's just continue. You just repeat that you're doing 3 square knots. And here's number 2. And as you do your square knots, you're allowing this zigzag effect to appear, because that is the point of this particular design. It's mixing the 2 types of cord and letting it come out this way. This would also go well if, instead of using the cotton cord, you were to use leather lacing cord to make your braid with, and to do the square knots with this unbleached wax linen over the top of it with the beads. That would be a nice effect as well. So I'm going to continue to do this. I'm going to do the rest of this the knot tying and the beading off camera, and then I'll come back to you when I've got it all done and show you how we're going to finish off the knots, bury the ends so you don't see them, and I'll see you back in a bit. Okay, so here we go. What I did was I wound up only putting on a dozen of 12 of the beads, because when I got to this point my length was enough. To put on any more would be excessive. So now what we're going to do is we're going to finish this by using the tapestry needle to embed our wax linen cord. Basically we're splicing it back into the braid, and what we're going to do is we're coming in as close as possible to where the final knot is, and just coming in into the braid itself, and trying to make sure that we're in the center of the braid and not really making surface until the point where we're going to come back out. And to help me pull this through without causing disruption to the rest of the piece, I'm going to use my vinyl pliers. Alright, so that one's good. So we see how the cord has just disappeared in there. It's come out here. We're going to trim that off in a minute after we do the second strand elsewhere. Alright, so now we're going to trim off our excess without cutting any of our braid cord. And that will just disappear in there. So there, we've got that portion of it done. Now the fun part is during the Turk's head knot, and I like to actually start on a base that is going to be able to slide the Turk's head knot back off onto here, and there we have it. And we've got our Nordic inspired braided bracelet with wax linen and agate beads, and I think it came out really well. And this one's big enough it'll slide over my hand and go on my wrist. So what's our finished length? We can measure it just by stretching it around on our ruler. So we're at 12, roughly 14 inches if we count all the way to the tip of all of our little fringes. And how much of that is in overlap? And of the 14 inches, about 2.5 inches is the overlap to the Turk's head knot. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I would like to, see your comments. And if you do this yourself and you decide to dye your cord, which I would encourage you to do so, send me pictures. I'd like to see what your version of this comes out at. So I'll be back with the final in the set of 4.